Hello, welcome to the Wildline podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. So we're going to do a little bit of a weekend review today, like per usual, for the big weekend. It was supposed to be a big weekend, but it ended up not being a big weekend, unfortunately. So the numbers just dropped for the weekend of October 6th through the 8th. They dropped about an hour ago. These are estimates. They're usually pretty right on. The industry is very good at estimating what's going to happen today on Sunday. So these estimates are usually about 90% accurate. And so, you know, it's going to be a deep dive into Blade Runner, I think, is what this episode's all going to be about. I will talk about the rest of the top 10. I might hint at what's coming out next week. But this is the Blade Runner weekend, right? Like, this is supposed to be a big celebratory sort of sci-fi geek event moment. You know, Blade Runner was, if you're a little bit younger, probably under the age of, let's say, 30, you probably don't understand why Blade Runner is so important. You know, Blade Runner is a movie that came out in the 80s that was, for all intents and purposes, ignored by the general population. It was your typical cult classic, right? Had a decently sized budget, had obviously a big star in Harrison Ford, but when it hit screens, it hit like a dud. Nobody went to see it. It was kind of a disaster. But throughout the years, the initial reaction was positive with more of the intellectual film critics. They understood its importance. They understood how significant the visuals were, the soundtrack. They understood that there was something important about Blade Runner, and maybe they couldn't put their finger on it back when it came out. But as the years passed, a lot more people began to revisit the film. It became essentially like this nerd icon, right? Like, it's certainly a cult classic film, but I think it has even a bigger footprint than just your typical cult classic. You ask what I would have thought, and this is going to get into a whole other discussion about nerd culture and popular culture and stuff like that. But let's say 15 years ago, let's say right around 2002, 2003, if you asked somebody who you thought was nerdy, you know, maybe into gaming, maybe into like really into Star Trek or really into Star Wars and stuff like that, not to use the cliches, but those are cliches for a reason. If you ask them about Blade Runner, their face would probably light up and be like, holy shit, I love that movie. It's so amazing. I watch it all the time. But outside the sort of general masses, Blade Runner still, even 30 years later, just wasn't something that if you walked up on the street to somebody in any city and asked, have you seen Blade Runner? You know what it is? They're probably going to say no, right? So it always sort of had this very sort of heightened status in the nerd world. And my assumption was that, and this is the assumption that has been proven wrong this weekend, was that it's super respected status within the nerd world would translate over into a decent opening for Blade Runner in 2049. It's been 30 years later. You got Ryan Gosling, a huge star. Denis, whatever the fuck his name is. Net Villeneuve, what the fuck, he's French, Canadian. I don't know how to say his name. He did Sicario. He did Arrival. He's basically at the top of his game right now. Amazing director, amazing cast. The visuals look unbelievable. The soundtrack and the trailers and stuff look good. I thought and expected this movie to pop off. Like, I was thinking projections were in the mid 40s. Those were conservative. Those were from the studio. That was from Warner Brothers. They were saying, oh yeah, we expected like 45. What that usually means is the rest of the industry is expecting about 50, maybe a little bit higher. Warner Brothers does that because they want good press on Monday and say, oh my God, it outdid our expectations. So going into this weekend, tracking 3 weeks ago is when tracking starts, said 40s-ish, mid 40s probably. I thought that was too low. As of a week ago, I was saying at least 50, maybe 60, maybe 70. In my gut, my truest sort of feelings, I thought it was going to be high 60s. And so when the numbers started rolling in on Thursday, there wasn't alarms didn't go off until Friday afternoon. When the Thursday previews came in, and it came in at $4 million Thursday night, it was lower than I expected. Now, again, preview numbers are really, really hard to extrapolate on. Just to give you an example. So let's just take a movie that also opened at 7 p.m. on Thursday, because remember, this whole previews thing has changed a lot over the last 10 years. It used to be Friday at midnight, then it was Friday at 9, or Thursday at 9, now it's Thursday at 6. Sometimes it's even earlier. Despicable Me opened at 6 o'clock. This podcast is nothing if not granular, by the way. So we're getting into the nitty gritty details. So I'm looking at the Blade Runner $4 million when I see it come in about 10 a.m. on Friday morning. I'm thinking, oh, okay, like, you know, that's not terrible. I thought it was going to be higher. Mad Max Fury Road did 3.7 only a couple of years ago. That ended up coming in at $45 million for the weekend. So when I saw that $4 million, another example would be, let's say, Kong Skull Island. That did 3.7 million in previews, ended up with $61 million on that weekend. Really huge extrapolation there, right? Like, so it's all over the place. You know, that's a $15 million difference in the opening weekend just with the same preview number, right? So we don't really know. I tell you what I didn't think was going to happen. I did not think it was going to come in under 40s, right? And just to remove the suspense from all of this, you know, Blade Runner 2049 is now estimated to have done $31.5 million for the opening weekend. That's right, $31.5 million. On a production budget of at least 150, but rumors say 170 plus. Massive, huge film. Tons of marketing, at least $60 million in marketing domestically, probably double that total worldwide. So conservatively $120 million on top of the 170. So you're talking about $300 million in cost without thinking about all the other costs associated with it. So it was a massive film and a huge bet by Warner Brothers, Sony, and Alcon, or the three production sort of studios involved with it. And for it to come in at 31.5 million is bad. Like, it's hard to even quantify how bad it is. Just because opening weekends are exponentially important. And what I mean by that is that if this thing had come in at 45, we'll run through a scenario here. Let's say this thing came in at 45 and, like projections had said, and because it's a high quality movie, Rotten Tomatoes score is an 89 by critics, 84 by audiences so far. That's been dropping, by the way. It was 90 something when it first got released, or the numbers first coming in on Friday. Audience score is very high. It's starting to drop a little bit. Metacritic score is 81. That's insanely high for a movie like this. Letterboxd score, which I just started following a little bit, 4.3 out of 5. Very, very good rating. So the quality apparently is there. I'll get to my theory on that later. Because I think that as that audience score drops on Rotten Tomatoes, I think we are seeing a huge, massive disconnect between three different groups of people. So the quality was there. So what I'm essentially saying is that let's just assume a 3x multiplier based on that quality, because it seems like it's an incredibly high quality blockbuster film. So let's say it opened at 45, has a 3x multiplier. Let's be generous. Let's say it does 3.2, just based on that, on the glowing acclaim from critics. So that puts it at 144, right? And that would be okay. That would have been an okay opening. I think Warner Brothers, or an okay run. I think Warner Brothers, Sony, and Alcon would be like we wanted a lot more, but like, we'll deal with that, probably double that and then some internationally. So hopefully they'd get over that $300 million mark just for the box office take. They still might have lost some money because they dumped way too much into it, but it wouldn't have been what's happening now. right? This is now a disaster. This will probably put Alcon out of business. Like, that's how big of an issue this is. They put all their chips on the table for Blade Runner, and it flopped. So it actually did $31.5 million this weekend. Let's assume, because of the quality, that it still keeps a 3-2 multiplier. That would put it at, of course, why is it always my calculator never works when I want it to? $100 million total. I doubt it's going to get there. I really do. I doubt it's going to get to the $100 million mark. So just based on opening weekend, because it was off by about $14 million opening weekend, it's going to be off about 50 in the long run. That's why I mean by the opening weekend being exponentially important, because if you're off this opening weekend, it's like a ripple, and it plays out and out every weekend after that. So they needed this thing to pop off. They really needed it to pop off this weekend. And even if there was maybe a negative reaction amongst the general audience, like, then it could, sneak out with like a 2.8, 2.9 multiplier and kind of do okay. But even looking at these numbers, I hate to say it, but it was almost set up to fail. And a lot of people brought this up earlier this month when the tracking numbers were coming in, and I was on the hype train because I love the original Blade Runner. It's certainly not a perfect film. It has a ton of flaws. But the highs are so high in that movie that it's just, you can't not love it as a sci-fi nerdy person. It's just so good. And film noir, for that matter. And so going into this weekend, I was very hyped. There's been a ton of marketing and a ton of hype on Reddit and places like that. And so I was just expecting that 45 would be like the floor. I was thinking like 50 might have been the floor. And so I was thinking much, much higher than this. But when people were saying this, there were people online saying, or sort of countering that, like, well, I don't see how it's going to open that big. The runtime's too long. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes, which means that you're at least in your seat for 3 hours, right? When you count the 20 minutes of previews, which there are about 20 minutes of previews. I actually timed it before because I'm a nerd. So you got a 3-hour runtime, essentially, right? You have a movie that we think is important in nerd culture, but apparently it's just not. Right? It may be important within a minority, a sort of subgroup within what I would call popular nerd culture, but it is not a popular or well thought of film by the general population, and even the general population of nerds, which I was blown away by, because I'm just starting to realize this now, that something has happened in culture over the last 15 years. And what has happened is that nerds weren't cool, right? Growing up in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, nerds were never cool. I can't think of a single moment in my life before 2003 when a nerd, somebody who was into science, was into like comic books, was like super passionate about a TV show or a movie series or anything like that. I never in my life had ever seen that person be what you would call socially popular. And that sort of, when you take that deeper, it's just, being a nerd was kind of an social out-group phenomenon, right? It was more for people who didn't really fit into where they were living. This is certainly the case with me when I was growing up. I was a huge nerd, but not like, pocket protector or anything like that. I was super into video games. I was really into movies. Obviously, that has continued on. And I was really into like X-Files and stuff like that. And so that stuff was never popular with like what I would call the in-social group, right? That changed in the early 2000s. I don't know what changed it, to be honest with you. But I saw it firsthand. And as a nerd, to see like the things that you were really into and your friends were into and either other nerds were into, to see that become socially popular and shift into the social in-group was honestly kind of mind-blowing. It didn't really make any sense to me, and I still don't really understand it. But it happened. And it happened by the time 2010 rolls around, 7 years ago. Nerd culture has become super ascendant. And in 2014, there's some article in the New York Times that basically stated that like sort of nerd geek culture and mainstream culture have never had more crossover than right now. And I think that's still the case here in 2017, about 3 years later from that article. So something happened where nerds became cool, is as simple as you can put it. If you want to pinpoint a moment when that really happened, look at the character of Seth on the OC, summer of 2003. A true sort of nerdy, kind of maybe even effeminate, sort of not like your quote unquote alpha male, him sort of being a popular character on a TV show, you know, dating a hot girl, like that was like weird because that really wasn't the case before. And that was that was starting the shift. I don't think that was like the reason why. I think the writers and producers were seeing something that was happening in culture and sort of putting it on TV. And that has sort of played out that way. Like nerds sort of became alpha. And then there was a whole nother part or sort of reaction to that where you have like programmers and stuff like that, where alpha males were mixing in with nerd culture and you couldn't really pick them apart anymore. And that's where we're at now. Like I can't really figure out what you would call quote unquote nerd culture versus sort of mainstream culture. They have crossed over to the point where you can't see the differences anymore. And you don't have to look any farther than comic books and comic book movies and stuff like that. Like before 2000, there just was not a comic book Comic-Con culture that was even remotely popular. They certainly existed and people were into it, but it was very much off to the side, people doing their own thing, not really interacting with the rest of the masses, if you will. That has completely changed. That's black and white from where it was 20 years ago, right? If you went to Comic-Con in 1997, like I'm sure there would be like Sarah Michelle Gellar fans there and stuff like that, but like look at the Comic-Con attendance, the San Diego one, the main one, and you'll see it just all of a sudden explode in about 2002, 2003, and then it's just been nonstop. It's kind of leveled off the last couple of years, actually. So what's the point of all this? Well, because culture changed a lot, I had assumed that other nerdy things that weren't popular 20, 30 years ago and became popular, I assumed that Blade Runner was going to be one of those things. I just assumed that younger people, younger than me, you know, I'm 35, mid-30s, so I assumed younger people than me would be super stoked about Blade Runner just because it had such a cachet in the sort of nerd film world. Right. And I've seen that you see that with other sort of films and properties that have come back and they kind of have new life now because people are a lot more aware of them and stuff like that. I don't know if Jurassic World really counts. Star Wars Force Awakens maybe counts. It was so mainstream. But there's been so many things that were for a small group of people that became super popular. Like another perfect example is zombies, right? Like I was a horror film nerd in the 90s and I remember going to Hollywood Video and basically renting every zombie movie that existed. And if I couldn't find a single person to talk to, this is kind of before the internet was super, super big. It was a lot more face-to-face stuff, IRL, if you will. And, maybe one of my friends was sort of into horror movies and that was about it, of about like, you know, 50 people that I knew well. And now that's just not the case. You know, now like zombie culture was very such a sort of subgroup of nerds. It was like a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup. It was a really small circle of people that were into like George Romero films and the Italian stuff and Return of the Living Dead, like all that sort of world. And then, you know, you just look at the zombie culture now and everybody's into it. It's like this mass, you know, millions upon millions of people. The most popular show on TV is essentially a ripoff of George Romero's work. I don't mean that disparagingly, but The Walking Dead doesn't exist without George Romero and his films. That's the perfect example of something that was super sort of minority out group, small little group of nerds that now is part of popular mass culture. And I thought that Blade Runner was going to be able to piggyback on that, and it didn't. at all. $31.5 million opening weekend is a huge flop for this movie. It is a worst case scenario. Per theater average was under 8,000. Massive opening. I think it's like maybe one of the top 10 worst openings for opening weekends with more than 4,000 theaters. It's essentially a complete disaster. And so something happened there. Right. And like, I'm going to spend this podcast. I've already talked a lot about Blade Runner. I'm going to keep going because I kind of want to figure out what happened. Right. Like, and we can tick off the reasons why we think it happens and maybe narrow down one or two main causes as to the failure of Blade Runner. And there's no way around it. This movie's going to lose just a ton of money. And it's not only going to hurt Denis' career, the director, it's going to hurt sci-fi in general, and it's going to hurt sort of progressive and intellectual films as blockbusters. I mean, the disaster and damage is not just to the studios and the director and maybe the actors. I don't think Gosling and Harrison Ford are going to give a shit. It's really going to perpetuate out into the studio system. And the next time a movie comes up like a Dune, well, like, do you want to spend $200 million or $100 million on Dune? They're going to be like, no, absolutely not. Blade Runner. It's going to be like, it's ironic that it is played out just like the original on some level, where maybe the expectations were super high, you had a big star, everything was going well, and it just completely, totally flopped. But if we take a step back and we think about, what went wrong here? Let's start out with what went right, though, right? So I've already talked about the quality of the film. 89% Rotten Tomatoes from critics, 8.2 rating. That's on 238 reviews. The bottom line here is film critics loved this movie. They're ecstatic about it. They absolutely loved it. My favorite film critics were over the moon about it. Were basically gushing when they talked about it. So that didn't happen. So the quality, I would say the artistic quality was not an issue here. Just was not an issue. Sort of among the nerdier fans, like Letterboxd, I think is sort of represents the more film nerds. Also played very well, 4.3 out of 5 there. Metacritic 81, that just sort of supports the critics loved it. The audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is 84% and dropping. Started out at about 90 something. So there may be artistic quality of the film is not the reason why it flopped. That's totally marked off the list. But the bigger question that I have, and I'm sort of interested in, and after seeing it, I am even more sort of intrigued by, is what's the general audience reaction to it? And we have a measurement for that, right? We have cinema score. It came in an A-. And that's pretty good, right? Like, A- is not bad. You would have hoped for an A. A+s are super rare. Like, Hidden Figures was the last one. They almost never happen. A is pretty much about the best you can do for a movie like this. A-, not that far off, not that bad at all. If you see that, you see the critics' response, you're thinking this movie's going to do pretty darn well. It's going to break out, right? It's going to just sort of like, even if it doesn't break out opening weekend, it'll have super great legs and that kind of stuff. I don't think any of that's going to happen, to be honest with you. I don't think any of that's going to happen. Also, the issue with cinema score is that it measures Thursday night and Friday, right? So who goes to see a movie Thursday night and Friday? The fanboys and the people who are super into it and really want to see it. And I think that reaction to Blade Runner, that group of people, so there's 3 groups of people. There's film critics, they loved it. There's the sort of true believers. I don't like the term fanboy. I'm going to use the term true believer. True believers in Blade Runner and sci-fi and stuff like that. And they went to see it Thursday, Friday. They really liked it. They had no major complaints about it. And the reactions online on Reddit and stuff, just going through them anecdotally a little bit, but like also very, very good. People loved this film. That group of people. But then you have the third group of people. And the third group of people is what I'll call the general audience, the masses, right? People who are not film critics, are not super hardcore sci-fi nerds who wanted to go see it right away. Then you just have the general masses, the people who go to a few movies a year, they go to Jurassic World, they go to Force Awakens. There isn't really a good measure of their response to the film. And I'm sure like Post Track, whoever runs that, ComScore is a big analytics company in the film industry. They may have numbers on that, and they probably sort of tranche or tier the responses to the films, like over 25, what do they think about it? Males over 25, what do they think about it? I don't have that data. I hope to get it at some point in my life to sort of at least have the money to pay for it. So we don't know how individual demographics responded to this film. But if you're just using the tools that we have now, this is a really positive response to this film. So I think that the quality probably didn't have a lot to do with why it failed here, right? Because the quality seems to be great. Now, I saw it, and I consider myself a hardcore sci-fi film nerd. I love the original. I love Denis' work. I didn't think Arrival was amazing, but I loved Sicario, and I loved, what do you do, Prisoners? Yeah, Prisoners. Thought they were fantastic. I love his style. I think he has a great eye. I was absolutely bored to tears, and I thought the film was a complete train wreck. One of the worst film going experiences I've had in a very long time. And I would, obviously I was going to give it every single benefit of the doubt, but it was bad. It was like watching paint dry. That's the pace of the movie. Kind of just, I was blown away by how bad it was. And then I got pissed off later yesterday when I thought about it more, because I was like, this isn't just going to screw up I don't really care about the Blade Runner franchise. I don't give two fucks. I care about really, really good, thought-provoking, intelligent movies, and the quality of Blade Runner as I see it, and maybe I see it more through a general audience view. I am very particular about pacing and about narrative structure. I really, really like genre. And what I mean by that is I like genre elements, and I like when they're done well. Probably one of my favorite genres of film or type of film is rom-coms, because they follow a very specific formula, and the quality of that film is how much do they follow the formula and work with it. And it isn't about like doing whatever you want. It's about following these sort of loose guidelines and what you do with them. Right. And I think a lot of filmmaking, especially when you're talking about wide releases, is about that. It's about there's a set of rules, and it's like, how do you follow those rules? How do you maybe like undermine a couple of them, but kind of still stick with them? That's like, Spielberg is a good example who does that so incredibly well, which I think why he is so popular. Great documentary on Spielberg, premiered on HBO last night. What makes him such a powerful filmmaker is that he knows the rules, number one. He follows the rules, but then he plays with them, right? There's a difference between that and sort of what I would call like, maybe like Mother would be an example of this, which is an art film, which says, let's sort of screw up the rules and see what happens, or see what we can do when we break all of these rules. And that could be fascinating too, but that's art film. That's not Hollywood. That's not studios. That's not 4,000 theaters on opening weekend. That's like 20 theaters in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And then you see what the reaction is, and it's meant for a different audience. It's meant for sort of intellectuals and people who are interested in film. A lot of art films don't make sense unless you have experience with other art films and studying film, right? Or studying art in general. Totally different art, totally different medium, I would say, art film versus Hollywood wide releases. The issue with Blade Runner is that it is an art film. It is 100% an art film. Sure, it has amazing visuals. Sure, it has an awesome soundtrack. But at the end of the day, at its core, it breaks most of the rules of I would say, wide release, mass appeal films on purpose, knowingly, and that makes it an art film. And I think a lot of people who really liked it saw it as an art film. I thought it was terrible. And I don't know if that's because I went in expecting a wide release sort of version of Blade Runner, or if I just think it's terrible. And that's one of the things with art films, is that like they often provoke a very visceral reaction. And my reaction walking out of Blade Runner 2049 was, that was one of the worst films I've ever seen. And, you know, I defend that sort of opinion. Maybe I will change with time. The original Blade Runner had the same reaction among a lot of people. But this is all to say that, like, there seems to be this massive disconnect between critics, sort of sci-fi film nerds, and I think the general audiences. I can't prove the general audiences sort of part yet, but I think I will in the next couple of weeks, because I think what's going to happen here is number one, the general audience didn't want to see this. $31 million is still a lot of people. If you just assume that, like, the average ticket price is like, I'm going to say it's like $12. It's probably lower than that. Let's just say it's 10 for sake of whatever. 3.1 million people saw this movie this weekend. 3.1 million people is what percentage of the US population? Come on, math. Less than 1%. About 1% of the US population saw this movie over the weekend. That kind of makes sense to me. That's sort of like, okay, like, it's Blade Runner. It's not going to be massively popular. But I think at the end of the day, the general audiences didn't show up because it was an art film, right? Like, they knew it, they saw it, that excited the critics, and that excited people like me. But for 99%, literally 99% of the US population that didn't see this movie this weekend, I don't think it excited them. And I think that was one of the big errors here. And it doesn't just go to marketing or anything like that, because the marketing was pretty accurate towards the film, right? So, like, if we sort of mark off the list of what possibly could have gone wrong here, it's not the quality of the film itself and an artistic, right? It's not the artistic quality of the film. That's not possible, like, based on what we've seen. It wasn't the marketing quantity. Marketing was everywhere. It was being hyped constantly. Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling were on every show. They did a full-on, super wide release marketing campaign, so it wasn't the marketing quantity. Now, you could say it was the marketing quality. What did they highlight about the film, and why? What did they highlight about the film, and sort of what was the hook, right? The hook was already there for nerds like me. I love Blade Runner. I love sci-fi. I'm going to go see this, right? The hook was probably there even for film critics, because Blade Runner is considered one of the greatest sci-fi movies of all time. You know, they're all sort of film historians, right? So they get that. But where is the hook for the general audiences, right? I didn't really see one, to be honest with you. And so I think the marketing quality definitely had a factor here in Blade Runner flopping, without a doubt. But I think it goes even deeper than that. I really do. And what I mean by that is, I didn't find the marketing to be that dishonest, right? Like, I felt like the marketing really hit home that, like, this is a Blade Runner movie. It's going to be like the original Blade Runner, which means it's going to be what I would call hardcore sci-fi, which is that, like, they're not going to walk you through what's happening. You're just gonna have to accept what's happening on screen is the story, and you're gonna have to, like, ride with it. And that takes a certain type of audience, right? A certain type of audience member to sort of give up their sort of questions about what's happening and just go with it, right? And I think the marketing sort of I don't know, definitely pointed to that style of movie. I think the issue here was that on a conceptual level, you know, let's just assume the budget was 170. I know it's higher than that, but let's just assume it's 170. That's a massive, massive budget. Like, that budget is outrageously high. So one wonders who greenlit that budget. And among the Warner Brothers, Sony, Alcon production studios, who thought that Blade Runner was going to have a mass appeal enough to make at least $400 million worldwide? That's sort of the number being thrown around now, is that it has to make $400 million to break even. It won't come anywhere near close to that. And if you're just extrapolating upon that number, what it would need to make domestically, let's just assume a 45% take for domestic on that 400 million. So about 180 it would have to make. It's going to struggle to make $100 million, just to give you sort of an example of that. And let's say it makes 100 worldwide, you're talking about 220. It's going to be well over $150 million short. So this is going to be one of the biggest flops probably ever, at least definitely in recent memory. I mean, King Arthur probably will be bigger, but maybe not. I don't know. I have to look at the King Arthur's number. The point is that it's a massive, massive flop. And then early in the podcast, I said, maybe this kind of feels like the film was set up to fail. And I feel like the more that I read and the more responses that I get and the more I look at these numbers, it feels like there was no way this film could be successful, right? And the mistake that I made, and I think that the studio made, was that because Blade Runner is so hyped up among a certain group of people, that hype would translate out to the general audiences, and it didn't. It didn't at all. And, you know, just to sort of like look at what happened this weekend and who was there and who showed up and who didn't, 53% of the audience was males over 25. That's my group of people. These are people who probably knew of Blade Runner from growing up. Obviously, some of them probably saw it in the theater when it first came out. But that was the majority of the audience, was that male over 25 demo. Only 24% of the audience was under 25 years old. So what you had here was a movie that skewed much, much older. Well, not much older. It skewed over 25, right? And the young people just did not show up at all. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that could have happened. They didn't market it correctly, blah, blah, blah. Like, they didn't do social media right. They didn't talk to influencers as much. You know, marketing has completely changed over the last decade. I mean, you cannot understate that. Like, marketing is a completely different industry and discipline right now. Like, it has nothing to do with what it was 10 years ago. You could say that, but I would say that the concept of the film itself, right? The idea that you are going to remake Blade Runner, essentially. It's a sequel, but it kind of feels like a reboot too in the same time. The thought that you were going to do that and then make over $200 million or about $200 million domestically was a massive, massive bet that didn't really make a lot of sense looking back on it. And I think, you know, the assumption that even assuming that the general nerd audience would show up for it, which it did not at all. There's a lot of nerdy people under the age of 25 that did not see this, but they'll go out and see Wonder Woman. They'll go out and see Guardians. They'll go out and see any comic book movie like Suicide Squad, even if it's shit. They'll go out and see it, right? Because it's part of their culture, and like, it was exciting for them, and they got something out of that experience, even if the movie was trash, like Batman vs Superman or Suicide Squad, which I think are both terrible. You know, you look at the audience reactions to that, especially among younger people, they loved it. They had a good time. Blade Runner wasn't a good time. Didn't really seem attractive to the young people at all. And so, you know, I think from the get-go, the production studios, Warner Brothers, Sony, and Alcon, definitely backed themselves into a corner. And there was, you know, thinking about it now, there wasn't really a clear path for this movie to do well. And I think the budget was way, way, way too high. If they had shot this for $80 million, I think that would have been, and if that had happened and it opened like it did now, it probably would be in break-even territory. But even then, it would have been tough. I think it would have worked much, much better as like a television series or a limited series on Amazon or Netflix, like maybe 8 episodes. That would have been awesome, I feel like. And with the story that they had in this, I thought the story in Blade Runner 2049 was actually really good. The way that it was displayed on screen was an absolute shit show. Terrible pacing, awful editing, the narrative structure, or the narrative pacing was just one of the worst I've ever seen in a movie like this. It's just awful. There was something there within the Blade Runner mythos and brand and universe that could have made a really good sort of new TV series, or maybe even a movie if it was shot for half of what it was shot for, right? But by inflating the budget that much and by locking themselves into a single film, they really just backed themselves into a corner where they couldn't win. And you know, at the end of the day, you know, I've talked a lot about Blade Runner. I could probably talk about a lot more. I don't want to talk about too much more. It's already at like a 40-minute mark. Jeez. I think at the end of the day, it was just a failed concept that should have never probably gotten past the point of the initial production and development. And if it did, the production budget should have been slashed down to like 70 or 60. You still could have made a really awesome movie for that type of money. But this was just it's just a disaster for everybody involved, and it's really gonna hurt sci-fi films in general. I know I sound like the sky is falling, but you know, the industry sees something like this, and they say never again, right? Because they're gonna lose $150 million, $100 million on this. Alcon Studios is going out of business probably. They put all their chips on this movie. So you have kind of devastation on the business side of things, and that will ripple out. Alien Covenant is another example from this year of sci-fi just completely flopping. And, you know, I mean, I don't mean Avatar sci-fi. I mean like rated R, violent, kind of edgier, more progressive sci-fi. I don't know. You know, I think they're going to dump that money into horror films now because it's just much more viable genre at this point. You know, and overall, it's just, I think the overall feeling that I have is just real kind of disappointment and some anger that, and it sounds so stupid that I'm angry about this, but I am. It's like, this could have been such a cultural sort of movement, not movement, more of a cultural like icon moment. This film could have really made people think, could really kind of change culture in a way. Like I think the original did with a small group of people. This could have done that with a larger group of people. And I think it failed. It not only failed sort of the hardcore sci-fi nerds, even though they say that they love it. I don't know if they're going to feel that way in a year. I just based on what I saw and walking out of it, I thought it was just atrocious. Not like Transformers bad. I'm not saying that. It was just sort of like if you shoot for Mount Everest and only get to like, you know, Mount McKinley. Why am I using mountain metaphors? Essentially, they aimed to hit a certain height and they fell so far short of it that it just stings on some level and it makes it so much worse. If they had aimed half as high and hit a little bit closer to it, it would feel better. But like it just didn't get anywhere close where the aspirations for this film were. And so I think it's a huge bummer. I think at the end of the day, it could have really connected with a large group of people, but I think the film was just wrong. And, you know, I don't even know. I sort of attacked the concept of it. Sure. But if you shot this for $80 million and could get it out in a wide release and it was good, I think it would have been pretty awesome. And they just failed. They failed pretty much from the start on this, despite the fact that it looks amazing. And despite the fact the soundtrack is awesome. It looks gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. I hope the cinematographer or director of photography gets an Oscar for it. I mean, it's one of the most visually lush and beautiful films I have ever seen. But it's almost like it's a screensaver. Like the story is so inert and so awfully done that even if general audiences did show up and this did like 40 and 50, I think it would have collapsed in that second weekend, and there would have been a really strong negative reaction to the film. But as of now, you know, the film critics and the sci-fi nerds are happy. 99% of the US population is either not happy or didn't go see it, essentially. And that's sort of, I think, the problem, because you want really good art as a product like this is to be consumed by a lot of people, not to sound like a sort of anarchist capitalist, but you really want people to see stuff like this, and you really want them to think about the future and think about where our society is going. That's the whole point of this type of art and these types of movies. And now it's just, you know, all this money was spent, all these people were involved, all this hard work, and no one's going to see it essentially. And even if they did see it, I don't even know it's worth seeing. So I would just say worst. This is the worst timeline we're on. I know people are using that for Trump, but this feels like the worst timeline for Blade Runner. Just a total and epic disaster. And we'll follow it as it goes along. I can't see it having a multiplier more than 3x. So you're looking at probably about just sub $100 million. Maybe a lot of people go later. Maybe it can break that $100 million mark. Maybe legs will kick in a little bit more. I doubt that's going to happen. It's only got about a month before it's going to get destroyed by Thor. Okay, so enough about Blade Runner. I know I talked about it a lot. I had to talk about it just because it was just such a big deal. I'll be following up with it over the next couple of weeks. Let's talk about the rest of the top 10 real quick. The Mountains Between Us, kind of a romance drama movie, opened at 10.1 million, about 3,100 theaters. Per theater average was 3,270. This is kind of expected, maybe a little bit lower than the tracking was saying. Production budget was only $35 million. I would say this is an okay performance. I feel like this one's going to have good legs. I didn't actually look up what it was doing on Rotten Tomatoes. 45% from critics, so not good. Ooh, 51% from audiences. Ouch. That means they did. I hear the ending is super, super slow. So for that one, I'm going to say kind of a slight underperformance on opening weekend, but I think the legs are not going to be fantastic on it. If that was the audience and critic reaction, I think at best you're looking at a 3x, probably ends about high 20s, mid 20s. Let's just say like 27 and probably will hit. Not a great performance. Fox definitely wanted this in the $30-40 million range at least domestically. Number 3 was It, 9.6 million. Another fantastic drop, 43% drop. Still on 3,600 screens in its 5th weekend. Per theater average was about $2,700. Total take so far is $304 million. It is the number 1 horror film of all time. If you don't count inflation and you don't count, I guess Jaws is probably the number 1 horror film of all time, but it's not really horror. It's kind of like thriller. I would say sort of traditional strict horror film. It's number 1 and will be for a very long time. Number 4 is My Little Pony, 8.8 million on 2,500 screens. Per theater average was about $3,500. This was under what they thought for this one. Although it's kind of strange. It was only on 2,500 screens. This one will probably have decent legs because it's a children's film. It might have, but it also might have been front loaded because of the whole Brawnies thing, dudes who are into My Little Pony. I don't understand it. I looked it up yesterday. I've heard about that stuff for a while, and I looked it up. I was like, I don't get it. I don't get a lot of things, so that doesn't surprise me. So that group of sort of true believers in the brand probably went to go see it Thursday or Friday. So it might be front loaded, but you're at least looking at like low 20s, 24, 25 overall, probably, when it all is said and done. If it ends up having a really good multiplier, you're talking high 20s, maybe low 30s, but I doubt that. Number 5 this weekend was Kingsman: The Golden Circle, 8.1 million in its 3rd weekend, 52% drop, 3,500 screens. Per theater average is about 2,320. Right now it's sitting at just below $80 million. This one, you talk about like how bad Blade Runner was. Like Kingsman had a production budget of 104, and it's going to end up probably making more money than Blade Runner. I mean, Blade Runner, what a disaster. Kingsman, I think this performance is okay. It's going to come in under the original. It will struggle, I think, to make. It's going to end up at like 86 next weekend. Then might limp its way into $100 million, but it's going to be close. It might not get there. Not a great performance, I think. They definitely wanted to be in the 150 range. for this movie, and it just did not perform. I hear it's very bloated, too long. The audience reaction wasn't great to it, so I think that's going to hurt its legs in the long run here. Number 6 this weekend was American Made from Universal, the Tom Cruise Narcos-esque film about him running drugs. $8 million on 3,000 screens, 52% drop on its second weekend. That's pretty good. That's okay. Pretty average, I would say. Per theater average was about $2,700. Total take so far was $30 million. I don't know. I don't know how this one's going to do overall. I feel like it definitely underperformed what Universal thought it was going to do, but then they also dumped it in September. So I feel like they kind of knew that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And so, it's under like Jack Reacher and the Jack Reacher sequel. It looks like it's going to be opening weekend. It did 16. Definitely will have a good multiplier because the quality is pretty high. Excuse me. So if it could hit 50, it'd be okay. I don't know where that's going to leave it in terms of profit and loss, but it could have been a lot worse. I feel like just because they dumped it with not a good marketing plan. So that was number 6. Number 7 was a Lego movie named Django. 6.7 million. Decent 42% drop. Remember, it's a children's film, so the drop's going to be lower. Lost 400 screens, still on 3,600 screens. Per theater average is under the Mendoza line for a super wide release. It's under 2,000 and just about $1,900. Total take so far is 43 in its third weekend. This one's a flop, big flop actually. The cost of production was probably lower, so it's Warner Brothers is not going to lose a ton of cash here, but it does, I think, really, really hurt the Lego franchise. Obviously, it doesn't put the sequel in jeopardy, Lego Movie 2, but I think it puts any other spin-off movies in jeopardy now. They probably may not do them unless it's like sort of the Batman thing where it's like two separate brands coming together. Number 8, surprisingly, was Victoria and Abdul. Focus features kind of an arty flick. Did 4.1 million, added 655 screens. Really good, strong, $5,700 per theater average. Total take so far in its third weekend is about 6 million. This one feels like it's very much overperforming. I did not expect this to be in the top 10. With that sort of per theater average is decent at 700 screens. Really, definitely a surprise there. It sounds like they're going to keep expanding this one out, and I guess that makes sense. Like they want to sort of squeeze as much out of it as they can. It's decently quiet now. With Blade Runner failing like it has, there's a lot of space in that sort of over 25, even for something like Victoria and Abdul, probably over 50 sort of age range as sort of an attractive demo for that. So I think it's going to do pretty well. I think it's going to sort of kind of skim underneath the surface here and make some good money. Number 9 was Flatliners. Surprisingly, only 42% drop. That's really weird. I wonder why it didn't drop like 50 or 60. That is really surprising. I'm thinking about it. Like terrible, trashy horror film released probably too early in the Halloween cycle here in the early October. Weird. Per theater average is just about 1,500. Total take so far is 12 million. This one's just a flop. There's no real other way to talk about it. Production budget was only 19 million. That's why they do horror films like this. They don't care if it flops that much because they're not going to lose a ton of cash on it. But that 42% drop is interesting. I can't figure out why it drops so little. You would think that people who are going to go see Flatliners would go see Blade Runner, but apparently they went to see some trashy, terrible film instead. Not that I'm bitter or anything. Number 10 was Battle of the Sexes. Talking about flops. Fox Searchlight, 2.4 million. Only lost 30%, which is good. Added 600 screens. But this, I don't know what happens here. Like, obviously, this is more on the art film side of things. Like, it opened limited. But the same people did Little Miss Sunshine. It definitely had the sort of twee art film crossover feel to it, kind of like a Juno-esque. where it easily, I thought, could have made 30, 40, 50 million bucks wide release. Audiences totally rejected it. I mean, completely rejected it. Its per theater average is $1,300 now in 1,800 screens. That's terrible. Absolutely terrible. I don't know why they rejected it. Maybe it's like it's too historical and people don't remember. Younger people obviously don't remember the 70s, but maybe they're not really that interested in it. I don't know. That one kind of like baffles me because it's got Emma Stone in it. It's got Steve Carell. Everybody knows who they are, even younger people. And Emma Stone's gone off La La Land last year, so strange, very strange. Maybe it's the curse of La La Land, right? Because Ryan Gosling and Blade Runner, total floppage. Battle of Sexes, Emma Stone, total floppage. Maybe they'll never do another great movie again, or successful movie. Probably not. That's the top 10. Anything outside the top 10 worth looking at? Mother and its fourth weekend dropped 75%. That's because all the theaters dumped it. 1,400 theaters dumped it this weekend. Per theater average is at $750. Awful. It will end up at about 18.5 million. Terrible on a $30 million budget. Anything else? I wonder how Wind River's doing. Let's check in with Wind River. Had a big drop, 67%. 68% drop. Lost a ton of theaters. Per theater average is at 540. It is in its 10th week of release. $33.2 million. Fantastic run for that. Actually did better than Hell or High Water. Did not see that coming. Weinstein really hit a home run with that one, but of course his entire world is falling apart because he's a scumbag. I don't know, that company might be done forever, actually, now I'm thinking about it. They're already sort of run out of cash, but now with the leader's problems with women in the press now, he's done, so no idea what's going to happen to that company. The other sort of one that I was interested to look at is the Florida Project. On A24, which is a great little sort of micro studio. Opened on 4 theaters, only did $38K. So that's not going anywhere, unfortunately. That will not break out. Might have some nominations with this one. Kind of a little surprised they opened it in October. I guess that does make sense. Willem Dafoe is in this. It just has a huge sort of... did really well in like Sundance or something. I can't remember which one it did, but there's a ton of sort of art house buzz on that. Did not translate into people going to see it. So that will have a slow expansion, I think. But unless critics really champion that film, it's going nowhere. And I don't see a lot of award nominations for it unless people start showing up to see it in New York and Los Angeles. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But I will say maybe that same crowd was going to Blade Runner, to be honest with you. But we'll see where it goes. That is it for the weekend. I'm probably going a little bit longer than usual. Not too long. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming up next week, if I can find it. Okay, so Blade Runner is going to be in its second weekend. It'll be lucky to make 16 million. I think, I don't know, now that I've thought about it a little bit more, it might do okay in terms of legs. It just got to be below a 50% drop next weekend if it wants to sort of save face on any level. I don't know if that's going to happen. It's going to go up against The Foreigner, Jackie Chan movie, STX Entertainment, to sort of co-finance with the Chinese groups. Action thriller rated R. I assume it's just like a typical Jackie Chan movie, which I think were more popular about 15 years ago, about early 2000s. I want to say he was kind of big in the US. Hasn't really had a huge hit in any recent memory that I have. That one is not going to do well, I don't think. The one that could break out is Happy Death Day, because this Friday is October 13th. So it's Friday the 13th. I might sit down and watch a little Friday the 13th marathon. One of my favorite horror series. So that could do okay. Now that Blade Runner has failed, I kind of expect there's going to be another breakout here just to sort of soak up that extra audience that didn't go see that. I think they're probably going to see Happy Death Day. They didn't go to see Flatliners that much. I feel like it, despite the fact, has, you know, the biggest horror film of all time at this point. It only opened about a month ago, to be exact. I do feel like people are hungry for something else, and maybe it's just going to be a really big horror September and October. Like I feel like Happy Death Day might break out. Marshall is also coming out, Open Road Films, which may not even be a studio soon. Looks kind of like it's a smaller wide release, only 800 theaters. We'll see how that one does. I don't expect it to do very well. And then Annapurna is putting out Professor Marsden and the Wonder Woman. I don't ask me on that one. Like, that's like a niche of a niche of a niche audience. Like, I don't know what they're doing. And wait, they're trying to put that out wide release? No way. What are they thinking? Luke Evans is in it. Rebecca Hall, she's great. That one doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what they were thinking there. Annapurna's got to pull their head out of their ass. Like, they gotta. Megan Ellison has all that cash from Larry Ellison. You know, he's like the CEO of Oracle or whatever. So she's got like a couple $1 billion to work with. Like, I don't know what she's doing. I don't know. Whatever. Not my problem. So that's coming out. And then, you know, honestly, like, the failure of Blade Runner has really opened things up this month. I thought next weekend was going to be quiet. Maybe not anymore. I think Happy Death Day is going to break out. I don't think The Foreigner is going to do very well. But then, like, it really changes October 20th. Because October 20th was, like, stacked filled with kind of really trashy films. Like, Geostorm is coming out, wide release. You know, before I thought, like, maybe it opens at, like, 15. Now I don't know. With Blade Runner sort of, you know, basically falling apart here, it's given a window for these movies to do well. The Snowman, there's a review embargo on Snowman until 9 p.m. the Thursday of release, so we know how good that film is. Like, it's going to be total trash. I don't know why Fassbender is like box office poison. I don't know what his deal is. I love him as an actor. He just, for whatever reason, he just does not connect with the general audience. So you got Snowman coming out October 20th. You got Geostorm, Only the Brave. I don't know that one. I think it's a war film, maybe. Oh, no. Only the Brave's the firefighter movie. That's going to break out. I can tell you that right now. I saw that trailer, and I'm about as far away as a sort of GOP red cap American, but I guarantee you that Trump audience is going to go to Only the Brave. They're going to love it. So that's going to break out. Snowman, who knows? I have no idea. Geostorm, I have no idea. I think it's going to do better than we thought it was going to do, just because it looks like a lot of fun, a lot of stupid fun. And then you got Boo 2 coming out. I do not think Boo 2 is going to recreate the magic of the first one in terms of sort of being a wide release hit with a lot of different demographics. I think the typical Tyler Perry, I think the African American audience is going to go see that movie, and I don't think it's going to expand much out besides that, unless it's fantastic. The first one I thought was terrible. I thought it was nearly unwatchable, to be honest with you, but I'm kind of judgmental, obviously. It just was just the way it was shot. I was like, what is this? This isn't even like a feature film. This was shot like a Lifetime movie, and it's like, I didn't get it. But people, you know, they reacted really well to it last week. I don't think that's going to get repeated though. Okay, what else? That's mostly it. And then the 27th, you have All I See Is You, Open Road Films. I don't even know what that's about. Is that Blake Lively's in that? She needs to pick better movies. Jigsaw, the 1000th Saw movie's coming out. Suburbicon, thank you for your service. Wow. Like, I think the big message for October is that Blade Runner had a super wide open runway until Thor on November 3rd. And I just feel like they blew it so hardcore, and it's gonna be really interesting next couple of weeks. You're not gonna have anything open over like 30 or 40 million bucks, if that. And it's all sort of waiting for Thor to come out, and then Justice League two weeks after that. So anyway, that's the show for the week, guys. I might come back and do a show for the opening weekend, sort of a little bit of preview. I'm kind of interested in these movies like Happy Death Day and Foreigner, so we'll see how it does if I come back on the weekend. If not, then I'll be back next Sunday. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast.